Okay, and tonight's speakers, we have Amanda Begley, Tree People's Watershed Coordinator for the Santa Clara River. She's our host. And myself, I am Tree People's Community Organizer for the Upper Santa Clara River. I provide technical support to the water equity team and help recruit groups of volunteers to the Angeles. And we also have Stephanie Liu, who serves as a mountain forestry coordinator. She works with our mountain forestry team in the Angeles, and she leads our volunteer restoration events. And now we would like to learn a little bit more about you. If you could all be so kind to put your name and affiliation in the chat. Okay. And before we begin, we would like to provide a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands and waters in the Upper Santa Clara River region, integrated regional water management, are unceded ancestral homelands of the Tataviam, Chumash, Serrano, and Tongva people. We gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose homelands we live and who are the ancestral stewards of the land and water. We make this acknowledgement out of respect for their longstanding connection to and protection of this area's watershed. We recognize that these tribes are still present in the area, along with a large number of displaced Indigenous people. Next slide. And tonight's agenda. First, we will begin with an overview of the geography of the Upper Santa Clara River watershed and discuss the sources of water in the area. Then we will talk about the impact that non-native invasive plant species have on the health of our watershed and their impact on wildfires. We will then move into the call to action, or what we can do to collectively to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Then we will open it up for Q&A. Next slide. Our watershed. If you're unfamiliar with the geography of the Santa Clara River watershed, it begins in the northern slopes of the San Gabriel Mountains to the east near Acton and moves in a westerly direction toward Ventura Harbor, draining into the Pacific Ocean. It covers over 1,600 square miles, with 40% of the watershed in LA County, which is the upper portion, and 60% in Ventura County, the lower portion. Its major tributaries include Castaic and San Francisco Creek in the upper section, Sespe, Piru, and Santa Paula in the lower. As one of the last free-flowing natural riparian systems left in SoCal, the Santa Clara River and its tributaries provide essential ecosystem services such as natural flood control, recharge of our groundwater basins, and nutrient cycling. While the LA and San Gabriel rivers are lined with concrete from the mountains to the sea, the Santa Clara River is still relatively wild, supporting a diversity of species, providing a multitude of ecosystem services that should be maintained. Next slide. And why is our watershed so important? As I mentioned, it's one of the last remaining natural river systems. If you're familiar with the history of the LA River, it was paved over into a concrete channel in the 1930s after a series of devastating floods as a measure of flood control. However, river systems provide natural flood control, but human activities such as increasing urbanization and industrialization along floodplain areas, as well as construction of roads and other impervious surfaces, can lead to erosion and degradation, making it necessary to implement flood control measures. Next slide. Water sources. The three main sources of water in the Upper Santa Clara River are the State Water Project from Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta region, water recycling, and groundwater. The percentages from each source fluctuate based on yearly weather conditions and its impact to water supply. In general, the Santa Clara River watershed receives more of its supply from groundwater than other parts of LA County. This reliance on groundwater makes the restoration work in the upper watershed all the more crucial. as the health of the upper watershed impacts water quality and supply. We will get into these dynamics more over the course of tonight's presentation. Next slide. And the value of open space restoration. With climate change, we have seen an increase in fire intensity. So it is imperative that we do what we can to mitigate the intensity of these fires. We know that more invasive plants on the landscape lead to more flash fuel load and therefore more intense fires. Invasives such as arundo in riparian corridors, which means along streams, creeks, or river channels, transitions from traditionally being a space for fire break to now being a place where fire moves across the riparian corridor with the intrusion of this highly flammable arundo. Also, burn scars lack vegetation, which means increased debris flows and erosion, which then leads to decreased water quality and water supply, which means more runoff and less infiltration or water going back into the ground. And now I will pass it over to Stephanie, who will explain more about this phenomenon. Next slide.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to take it back a few steps and kind of talk about what invasives are in the first place. And so invasive plants are species that come from elsewhere, oftentimes across an ocean, and they're usually something that is very aggressive in nature. So that plant will be very aggressive in taking over a space. They're adapted to our climate. And so a lot of our plants come from Mediterranean climates similar to ours, and they can thrive in this climate, but they haven't evolved along with the other species in our ecosystem. And so instead of being a plant who works with the other plants in the area and has checks and balances from predation or disease or anything along those lines, these plants often have nothing to check them. They'll just keep being aggressively spread throughout a region and can take over a whole area and cause what we call a monoculture of just a single species in a large swath of land. And so they can create problems because of this. But the ways that they get here are through agriculture. So mustard is one of our most intense invasive species. And they were brought here partially because they're fully edible by humans. Everything from the flower to the root you can eat, but the animals around here don't seem to want to eat them. So that is part of why they're so aggressive and they can take over space so quickly. Other species are brought over because of ranching. A lot of our non-native grasses are brought over or have been brought over historically for ranching in the way that they did it in Europe, per se. And so that's how we get a lot of our large swaths of just grass. If you see like those light brown areas where it's just dry grass, that was ranching. And then trade and travel. So when you fly somewhere, you might have gone through like agriculture checks, right? And that's because we are, as humans, are moving around so much now, we can bring species from super far away, just like on our clothes or in our bags. Same with pests, and they're invasive pests as well. And then there's the natural causes, right? So we have mustard, who has teeny tiny seeds that can spread on the wind, and it makes it super hard to manage. And then different animals can either eat them and poop them out somewhere, or it'll just get stuck to you, especially like you think of the grasses that we have out there, and they'll get stuck in your socks, they'll get stuck in your clothes. And so there's ways, and they're meant to do that. It's the design of the seed. It's also one of the characteristics of invasive plants, that it can spread really easily and has a very aggressive way of spreading. And so what we get is these very aggressive, intense plants that aren't being checked and take over a whole area. And that in turn can impact the whole ecosystem. And specifically, we're going to talk about today the watershed health. And so in our next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Specifically, hydrological cycling and our wetland and riparian habitats. So these are the areas that have a lot of water in them, whether that's a wetland where the water is kind of sitting there. And those areas are super important because that's where our water gets into the ground, right? That's where it has a chance to settle. And riparian habitats are the areas right along streams. So if you look at a stream and you see all the plants that are on the bank, we consider that the riparian habitat. And those areas, because they have so much water, are particularly sensitive to invasive plants. And that's because, think about Southern California, right? One of our limiting factors for plants is water. And so when you have these invasive species that might not be perfectly adapted, if they find a huge amount of water, they're going to be super happy, right? They're going to grow like crazy. They're going to be like, it's right here. But a lot of these plants are made to suck up a bunch of water. They're not, again, in balance with our ecosystem. And so they can suck up so much water because they've created this monoculture, because they're spreading without any controls. And they can actually lower our water table, which seems pretty extreme, but it happens. And so when you think about the water table, it's under the surface of the ground, and it has a dry section that you can see. And then as you go lower, it'll eventually be wet. Like if you were to dig a hole super deep, you'd eventually hit water. That's our water table. And if there's a bunch of plants up top drinking up all that water, that level is going to get lower and lower. And in addition to that, they can alter sediment flow. And so again, we're in stream areas per se, or wetlands, and the water is flowing through there. Sediment is also going to be flowing through there. You think about like sand gets picked up by water. A stream looks different after it's rained, right? And that's because of sediment flow. And so when you have these dense stands of invasive species, often the sediment doesn't flow in the way that it used to. It can get stopped, and so you have sediment buildup, or it can also make it so that more sediment is taken as it goes. And so it can also increase our flooding frequency because of all of these checks and balances that our native plants usually do. They have, I'll talk about more roots and the way that they're set up that can cause water to go down more quickly. But if we have this really low water table and a really thick kind of crust of dry soil on top, it's really hard for water to get into the ground quickly. And so we saw this with our recent rain events. We had extreme flooding, and that could be partially attributed to our areas with super low water tables, and therefore a lot of wet or dry soil that's been dry for a long time. And the water doesn't want to go into the ground quickly when the soil is so dry. And so all of these things together kind of create a positive feedback loop, and it just changes the whole hydrological cycle. Plants play a big role in that cycle generally, and when you change it to a monoculture especially, but also to plants that aren't meant to be there, and create a landscape that's different than what it's meant to be, it causes changes in that water cycle. And there's even more things that invasive plants do, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. Erosion. I talked a little bit about it with the sediment, and that is even more intense when you look at like the details of it, right? So if you have a native grass that's perennial, which means that it grows year after year, it's the same plant, it stays alive all year long, even through our super, super dry summers. That plant has super deep roots because it's evolved here, and it knows that in the summer it's going to get dry, and it has to tap into that groundwater that I was talking about earlier. So a lot of our native bunch grasses have roots that are very deep, think like 5 feet deep, whereas we have our non-native grasses that were mostly brought over for ranching. They have roots that are maybe like 2 inches deep. They're very little roots, and that's because they're doing the invasive species thing of the live fast, die young. I'm gonna put as much energy as I can into living for a little bit. I'm gonna seed, and then I'm gonna die. And so they don't need to tap into the groundwater. They're just gonna grow while it rains in our winter season. And so when you think about those teeny tiny roots, those aren't gonna hold a slope in place, right? They're not gonna hold sediment in the way that our native plants can. And so if you have a full field of these non-native grasses, that area is really susceptible to landslides and other sedimentation movement. And so if we're looking at a hillside that has just those grasses on it, all the water is gonna just run really quickly because it doesn't have good infiltration. And that quick running water could cause a mudslide very easily because there's no roots to keep it in place. And then the other thing about our native species is not just bunch grass, right? If in our native ecosystem, we don't have a field full of just bunch grass, it's going to be bunch grass and our chaparral species, different types of oaks and ceanothus and other species that have deeper roots because they're all made to survive the drought of the summer. And all of those different root styles, you could say, are going to keep that soil in place. And so that's why we love our native species, and our invasive species can cause a lot more erosion. Let's go to the next slide. And one more thing that the invasive species do, they also can change our nutrient cycling. So we've talked about dirt a little bit, how we don't want it to move so much. We also want it to be alive, right? Our soil is alive. There's a whole bunch of processes that are happening under there that you can't see, but are super important to our ecosystem up top. And so our native species have leaf litter. If you think about oak trees, you see all their little leaves on the ground, right? And even a lot of we do have species that die every year, and they have a different type of leaf litter or plant litter. And all of those factors together create a soil chemistry that's good for all of those plants living there, and also a soil ecosystem, keeping all those microbes alive, keeping all of those fungi under the soil alive, and keeping that balance. And so a lot of some of our invasive species, such as mustard, that you see in this image of hills of just mustard, right? Practice allelopathy, which is a fancy term, which just means they put out chemicals that inhibit seed sprouting and root development and change that ecosystem under the soil, and makes it really hard for other plants to grow. And this is great for the mustard, right? Because it can spread as much as it wants. It doesn't need that soil ecosystem in the same way that our native plants do. And so it can even add to this monoculture aspect, and make it really hard for the ecosystem to bounce back. Ecosystems are not super fragile, but if there's multiple factors that damage them, it can kind of tip the balance, and then invasive species can do more to tip that balance, such as excluding other plants through soil changes. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the next slide. And again, I was talking about how if you have a little bit of damage to an ecosystem, invasive species kind of have a door to get in. If you have, say, a fire in our chaparral ecosystem, you might have heard that chaparral or our native plants are made for fire, right? They're adapted to it, they're fine with it. And that's true to some extent. Chaparral is meant to burn every 30 to 150 years. And we're seeing it burn every 1 to 10 years, right? We're seeing a lot of fire, and we can talk about that in the context of climate change. A little bit of that, or a lot of that, is that our temperatures have been crazy. We've had record heat in recent years. And also another thing in Southern California that contributes to the fire is wind. So you have crazy winds, you have crazy heat, and that's just the perfect recipe for fire. So say you have an intact chaparral ecosystem and it burns once, it's going to come back beautifully. It's going to say, okay, it's fire time, everything's going to burn to the ground, but all of these species are made for that. They'll either sprout from the bottom, or some of them have seeds that'll resprout when they know there's fire. But if you then burn it again, another 5 years, it's going to have a little bit of a harder time. Those plants aren't meant to sprout back instantly. So if you burn it again, it's going to be quite the disturbance event. And that kind of opens the door to invasive species. And especially if you compound that with having human activity. So I talked about spreading those seeds in your socks, right? If you have someone hiking through the area, which is totally fine, especially if it's an intact ecosystem, but say it burned recently and you have seeds and it's a little bit vulnerable, right? Those native plants are doing their best, but invasive plants have a window to take hold. And so compounded damage can really impact this. But then you have these invasive species in the space, and they do their thing and then they die every year. And then you just have these dry corpses of invasive species on the whole landscape. And it kind of creates kindling. So if you have a spark come through there, you have a super hot day, that area is going to burn very quickly because there's so much dry fuel on the ground. A lot of our chaparral species, the native ones, have water in them all the time, even though maybe it hasn't rained in a month. They still have water content because they're alive. Maybe they're tapped into the groundwater. But our invasive species have nothing by the time the summer comes around. They're only dry. And so they're going to spread that fire super fast. The way that you put dry stuff in your campfire to get it to go quickly, that fire is going to burn quickly. And then if you have that second fire, you've really damaged the ecosystem. And then it's time for the invasive species to just take over the whole landscape, right? And so now you have just a field full of kindling and fires that can run through the field. And it's really hard to do anything to stop that. And this change in the ecosystem, you can see in this image, that back section was burned once in 1970. The middle one was burned again in 2001. And then, so it had 2 fires. And the one in the front was burned 3 times in the span of what, 30, 35 years. And so you can really see how it changes the ecosystem here. And then once you have fire, you have things that change the water cycles as well, right? The land that has been burned becomes hydrophobic even. And so that water really can't get into the ground, and it can cause more runoff. And then you have large volumes of water going into our waterways and not absorbing at all along the way. And so this change from native healthy ecosystems to invasive areas, invasive species areas, is called type conversion. And it's kind of the end product of too much fire. And so it can create that cycle, especially with the invasive species, kind of making kindling fields. We'll talk about what we can do, I think, in the next one. And so we have these problems, right? I've talked about all the things that invasive species can cause to go wrong, but it's not a lost cause. It's a positive feedback loop, but we can kind of stop it, try to take out those invasive species and put in our native species that can give us so many benefits, and try to make the ecosystem functional again. And that's what we do out in the mountains every weekend. Shout out to our volunteer supervisors that are here. You guys help us do it. But we go into spaces like what you see on the left that have been highly degraded, are full of invasive species, which you can kind of see, like if you're looking at that light brown at the bottom there, that's a lot of invasive grass. And then those bright yellow flowers you see kind of in there is mustard. And then on the hills behind it, you can see our intact chaparral. And so we just wanted to connect that intact chaparral and make it one big functioning ecosystem again. And another thing you can see here is that the area that's full of invasives is also where the water flows. And so it's the bottom of that valley. If it was going to rain, which it does, as we now know, the water will come down and flow through that area. And that's the area that has been degraded. So what we came in and did was take out as much of that invasive species as we possibly could, and we put in native species. And so in that right picture, you can see those little bushy plants, and those are our native species. You can see that they're not dry. And a lot of those that I'm looking at right now, in fact, most of them stay alive through the year. And so they'll have that moisture content through the year, and they'll create that functioning ecosystem. And in the next slide, I'll talk about how we do it. Here at Tree People, we rely a lot on volunteers, and we do our restoration with a lot of purpose and a lot of care. Rather than just going in, planting thousands of trees and calling it a day, we'll go in and make sure we plant something of a diversity of species, like to our best ability. we try to plant different species, and that creates that varied ecosystem that I talked about. And we also come back and care for those plants. And so each plant gets its own individual attention when it gets planted, but then for another 3 years after we plant it, we give it water every year, mostly during the summer when it's really rough out there. And that's mostly, you think they're native plants, like shouldn't they be able to just survive? But these are native plants that we've grown in a nursery. They're native plants going into what has been drought conditions most recently. And they need a little bit of help to get off the ground. They're also fighting against invasives in these areas because those invasives are already established. So we go in, we water them, we do weed abatement. So we take back those invasives and try to eliminate too much competition, and really make sure these plants can thrive. And so we create an ecosystem that's functioning. We see a little more animal activity in the areas that we've restored. And you can see some of the results of that in our next few slides. This is site 1 of San Francisco Canyon. And this canyon is in the Angeles Forest, in an area that has burned and also had some human activity, mostly recreation. And so it had been taken over by invasive species. So you see at that top left image, all those green spots with the bright yellow, that was all mustard, which we've talked about as our main enemy, invasive species. And a lot of dry stuff you see on the right because it all died. And so you have these huge blooms of just the same species invasive. And then they all die and create, again, you can see it, this field of kindling. And then if we go to the next slide, in 2018, we removed those invasive species. So you can't see that yellow or green, and it's a little bit less fluffy if you look closely, right? You don't see that like fluff of dead, dry stuff. And then on the right, you can see by August 2019, the plants that we put in have grown a little bit, and you see those green little dots everywhere in that site. Those are our native species starting to grow. And then in the next slide, you can see in March 2021, those little green dots have gotten a little bit bigger. And those, imagine like those little dots in the front were tiny bushes and now they're big bushes, right? And then by February 2022, you can see that it looks really similar to those mountainsides and the stuff outside of that border, right? And so what we did was go in, take out those invasive species and put in native species. And now we do very little maintenance on those plants. We don't water them often. We do some weed abatement still, but it's mostly grass, which is not great, but also not as bad as mustard, we like to think. But a lot of that area is going to be available for wildlife. It's going to be a little bit less vulnerable to wildfire. And it's just a functioning ecosystem, and it doesn't have the potential of spreading those invasives outside of the borders. It's just an improvement on the landscape. And so that's what we're doing. And then I think I'm going to pass it on to Amanda for the next slide.
Actually, I'll take it over.
Or Heather, sorry.
So I just wanted to discuss one of the local projects that we're doing in the watershed. As we mentioned previously, the invasive arundo is a huge concern for wildfires in this region. So one thing to note is the watershed-wide arundo management group, and they're helping to build additional capacity and planning for watershed-wide arundo removal across the entire length of the Santa Clara River, which spans both counties. And there's been several organizations that have been on board with this, such as the Santa Clara River Conservancy, UC Santa Barbara, Ventura County Resource Conservation District, City of Santa Clarita, the SCD Water Agency, Nature Conservancy, and many, many more. Next slide. And this right here, if you can see all those little green dots, this is actually a map from iNaturalist of invasive arundo that is found throughout the riparian areas of our watershed. So basically, whatever happens in the upper watershed is going to affect the downstream waters. So ensuring that the health at the source of the watershed is critical for the entire system. We kind of like to think of it as an interrelated network or web. For example, if we have seeds or rhizomes of invasives in the upper watershed, they're going to be carried downstream towards the Ventura County side, and they're going to continue to spread and grow with the help of runoff from fertilizers, which is very prevalent in the area since, as we know, Ventura County is a huge agriculture industry. And that's going to take up a lot of the water. It's going to outcompete the natives, and it's going to make the entire area more prone to fire and drought. So as you can see from this visual, all of those specimens are found in some of the tributaries in the upper watershed, and then they've been carried downstream, and now that has made the entire system more fire prone. Next slide. And so just to tie it all together, with warming trends increasing with climate change and the related uptick in fire intensity, which has impacts to water supply and quality, as Stephanie mentioned, wildland restoration is a really helpful tool in countering these trends, and protecting and restoring the upper watershed helps to heal the land after disturbance, and it assures less extreme impacts moving forward. To be able to see our sites transform from fields of mustard to a vibrant, thriving ecosystem has been really satisfying. And we invite all of you, if you haven't already been, to join us in this work. Last slide. And now we would like to open it up for a Q&A, or if you have any concerns around climate change, or you just have more questions about the work we do or invasives, I'd like to open it up.
And if you're more comfortable, you can type a question into the chat. We can look at them there. And I know that we have a few folks with us today who are volunteers working on this restoration effort. So just a shout out to you all for this work. It's really impressive.
I see one question in the chat. It's a great one about where do we get our seeds that we use in our restoration work?
It's a great question. We get most of our seeds from the area around where we're going to do the restoration. And so I think the forest has seed sections. And so there's a border, an area where if you're going to do restoration, you have to get your seeds from the immediate area. And that's for a few reasons. We want individuals who are well adapted to that area. We don't want to, if we're planting an oak tree, say, we don't want to go to an oak tree that's 50 miles away that has completely different conditions, grow it in a nursery, and then throw it in the ground at our site and say, survive, right? Because the genetics of any species can vary between individuals, and especially plants can become very adapted to the specific place that they're in. And so we want to take seeds from the immediate area to get individuals that are hardy in that area. And also we don't want to cause too much what we call genetic drift. So we don't want to, again, take species from a different area or individuals from a different area and bring them in and introduce a whole new genetic, I guess, like not code necessarily, but a genetic variance to our area. It also means that we get species that are native to and like abundant in the area we want to be planting in. And so just because we have a log that says like,
oh, redwoods, they're native to California, right? We don't want to start planting redwoods in San Francisco Canyon because they're not going to do well, right? And so we really want to make sure when we're doing restoration, we're trying to bring the land back to the way it was before it got degraded, to the best of our ability, the best of our knowledge. And so by taking seeds from the immediate area, we're making sure that we're not kind of introducing new factors that we don't know how they're going to impact the area. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're just trying to undo the damage we've done, if that makes sense. Yeah, if that answered your question, if there's anything more you'd like me to touch on that front. How you talk to the city or governing body. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I know a little bit about that. I can talk a little bit about it. I know that in our specific site, we had a grant kind of to start with, and it had to be in the Angeles forest. And so we worked with the forest to choose spots that needed restoration. And we work with the forest to think about whether it's accessible, how degraded it is, what kind of work can be done there, right? And so in that case, the grant was already in place, right? And so the forest already knew that land was going to get restored there. But we also, as Heather does every day, try to integrate into the community, right? And so we don't want to just go into an area that we're not from and just start working and not tell anyone what we're doing or anything along those lines. So Heather, if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's kind of different, the work that we do in mountain forestry. It differs from our urban forestry. You know, in urban areas, they have to get permits, and it's kind of a lengthy process. But it looks a little bit different in the mountain forestry areas because we are in the Angeles National Forest, so you have to work with the Forest Service. So it's going to look different in urban areas than in mountain forestry. And in the upper Santa Clara River region, we're only doing mountain forestry at the moment.
Yeah, we have had situations where we really need to talk to landowners, whether that's the state or the county or whatever it is, and really kind of sell our project, especially if we have funding that's not from the landowners. And that is kind of doing essentially what I did today, right? Talk about what we're doing and why we want to be doing it and how it will positively impact that land and the area around it.
Yeah, typically we'll go to like local city council meetings. We have to develop relationships with them, kind of let them know like that we received a grant and that we're going to be planting in that area. But that's also kind of a long process, just kind of fostering those relationships.
And then Emmett asked about the current methods of removal of arundo and how fast the recovery would be in the lower part of the watershed.
I believe Amanda maybe or Peter can speak more about that.
Yeah, because of the dynamics with arundo that was shared by Heather and a little bit by Stephanie, where it can spread by the rhizomes all the way down the river system. That's why there's really this need to do this watershed-wide arundo planning and management, because just doing kind of one-offs here and there, it's a little bit like whack-a-mole because it kind of keeps coming up. There are some, there's a few methods. They can use mechanical equipment to remove them out because they can be so intense, those rhizomes are really in the ground. And then they also do a method, what's the exact terminology? I want to say the daub and where you use
glyphosate.
Or,
like dip it, right?
Or what is it, Peter, exactly? Do you know how to
explain
that?
You mean where it's cut down and treated and
yes.
Yeah, it's probably the most effective way. It's, it is using chemicals on the arundo, but it has, I think it's showing to be probably the most effective way of achieving eradication, which is, just cutting down and then being able to soak the the bottom portion of the plants with herbicides, so that's probably, one of the more effective ways. And of course, with all of the heavy rains there was a lot of concern about that, then pulling some of those rhizomes out because there was a lot of flow going down the river. But it definitely makes the difference. The more we work upstream, the more it benefits downstream. And as that map showed with all the green dots, it definitely gets heavier the further downstream you go in terms of the intensity. There are really some significant efforts at work across the river, including, Heather mentioned some of the major partners like UC Santa Barbara and some other engineering firms that have been doing studies and trying to determine what would be the priority areas where it's the most intense, where, if we put our time and energy and money into certain spots along the river, to achieve the greatest result in the fastest amount of time. And so that has been taking place, that research, and then that's led to entities who have some responsibility to be able to do that. There are a few gaps in all of that. Some of the successful places are like City of Santa Clarita, that has really been taking charge of priority areas that hit certainly like south of Bouquet Canyon, or I guess that would be west of Bouquet Canyon, toward the county line. It runs into a little bit of a challenge where it moves into property owned by Newhall Ranch, and where they're doing all of their development and trying to work on mitigation and easement, and that's a much slower process, and really, really huge groves of Arundel through that area. If you go, on the 126 east of the county line, you can really see these, deep groves of Arundel down by the water. And then a lot of groups that work in the lower part of the watershed, like Santa Clara River Conservancy, Trust for Public Land, that has property. And then the final, and Friends of the Santa River. The final challenge is that there's not one entity that has responsibility for the river. So you've got, the city of Santa Clarita, you've got different entities that have acquired the land, like Trust for Public Land, who's purchased the land and taken it into a long-term preservation. But you've also got a lot of stretches of agricultural land. So trying to work with those private commercial owners and figuring that out, there are different entities trying to work with them. So trying to get, and Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game Commission from the state, I think the Army Corps of Engineers. There are so many different entities that are involved in ownership, if you will, of that river. And so there's a huge effort to try to make that coordination happen. And it's a big task, but it's slowly happening. Turn it back over to y'all.
Wonderful. And I see one other question here. If left unchecked, would the ecosystem eventually self-regulate and make itself unlivable for invasive species?
I think I can talk a little bit about that. In general, yes, that would be great. If we don't, if say a disturbance happens where it burns, or there's a little bit of human activity, if we just let it be for a little bit, it had some invasive species, or it like was a little bit degraded or trampled or burned, any of that, then it could totally bounce back on its own. The problem arises when an ecosystem has kind of tipped that balance, right? It has gone from its native species with some invasive species, or it's a little bit degraded, to it's a completely full field of mustard or it's only grass. And so then you run into the problem of even like seeds, where are your native seeds coming from if they're not like on the mountains around it. And also those invasive species, if they've already taken over space, they're very aggressive. They're very unwilling to let other things grow, if that makes sense. And so we talked about the allelopathy with the mustard, like it makes the soil inhospitable to some extent, especially if it keeps growing there. And also other species are just so aggressive and quick growing that by the time, say, like a little oak has popped out of the ground, it's already covered by weeds and maybe isn't able to thrive because it's like so covered that it gets no light. That's a possibility. A lot of our plants out in the chaparral and other plants might be a better example of that, do need a little bit of light, right? They're meant to be in open sun. And so when they're covered with clover, with grass, with mustard, they're not going to thrive. And also those invasive species take away a lot of the resources from our native plants. So again, if you have a field full of mustard, it grows really quickly and needs a lot of water because of that. So it'll take all the water from the area. It'll take all the nutrients from the area, things along those lines. And so once you've tipped into that like heavily degraded zone, it's really hard for an ecosystem to bounce back on its own. There is a lot of, especially in other places where it rains a lot more, we'll just do invasive removal. And so Tree People doesn't do this so much because of our specific ecosystem, and we've been thinking about different ways to do restoration. But in other areas, if you can just take out those invasive species and keep them down, the ecosystem will come back. It's just those invasive species that are kind of keeping everyone out, right? But here, because it doesn't rain, because our invasive species are so aggressive, we need to give it a little bit more help. And that's why we plant native species. We've been thinking about seeding recently and like starting from seed out in the field. But our current method is planting plants and really trying to keep it on top of those invasive species. That's a great question. Big answer, yes, possible, but not in certain situations. And I don't know if it would ever be unlivable for invasive species. That would be great. I would love that, right? But I don't know if it would ever quite be fully unlivable. Like if you look at trails, you'll have mustard just like a lot along the trail, but then you'll have like 2 mustards in the distance because they can get there and they can live pretty much in any condition. But it's only super far away, right? Because there's a native healthy plant community. And so keeping it down, keeping the numbers of invasives down is really our goal. Unlivable, I really wish, but I don't think it would ever quite get to that point. But great question.
Cool. Thank you.
And I don't know if we said this, but if somebody wanted to come out and go to our restoration sites, how would they find out about it? It's on our calendar.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
our volunteer, treepeople.org at our /volunteer calendar. You can see all the different volunteer sites that we have going on, either in the urban areas or up in the Angeles National Forest. A lot of the stuff we showed with the pictures of San Francisco Canyon, but also in the Santa Monica Mountains as well. So there's a bunch of different options to come out and check it out and do this work with us. Any other questions anybody has?
Yes, just by eavesdropping, I've heard in San Fran at site 1, site 2, and site 3 that sage and oaks grow well next to each other. Is that a fact?
I don't know if there are any formal study. Well, I think we actually tried it because we saw a study. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'm gonna look it up now. But it isn't like a completely well-known, all-encompassing fact in the restoration community. I think a lot of restoration is such a new science. Because before we were like, land, whatever, it'll figure it out, you know? But now we have caused so much damage that we're like, how do we reverse this? And so this science is emerging and like growing all the time. But our team personally, especially people who have been there a long time, Alyssa, Thierry, even Sage and Matt, all of those people have seen it happen before their very own eyes, you know? And so that relationship between those two species does seem to be real. And I think the study might have been done in a slightly different area. That's another thing with restoration that, at least personally, I've found, is that if you're looking for a certain phenomenon, or if you're looking for research in restoration, it's hard to find, because every ecosystem is so different. It's like, I'm looking for these 2 species in the chaparral in Southern California with these conditions, right? We're on like a slope, or we're in a riparian area. And so I don't know if they saw an original study, or if they just heard from another institution that was a relationship. But even so, it may have been in a slightly different environment. And so them seeing it happen, and those 2, like that oak and that sage that were next to each other, getting super big as compared to everything around it. I would say it's true. I think if I were to conduct a study, I'd make it an even larger scale study. And we kind of are. We've been planting a lot of sages next to oaks. And then we have our oak site where we're just planting oaks. So we could, in theory, kind of think about that, you know? But yeah, that's a great question. And we are doing some studies about, we talk about sage and oaks in particular, and the sage grows a little bit faster than the oak. And so it can give that oak some shade, because oaks love shade, especially when they're babies. But we've been doing a study up higher elevation where we look at nurse plants in general. I think it's specifically chamise, where we have planted oaks and we've tagged ones that have a nurse plant, is what we call it, something that will shade that oak as it grows up, versus ones that don't have one, that are just in open areas. And so I don't know how long that study is going to run, but we might find out more in the near future about what we call nurse plants, and whether sage is like particularly better, or if it's just like the shade that it provides. But we do know about fungal networks under the soil, and that plants communicate. And so I really, really wouldn't be surprised if there was a specific relationship there. That's a great question. Thank you. Fun to talk about.
It is cool to see. I remember getting shown that at some of the sites, and it was true. It seemed like that the sages and oaks together were like doing so much better than the ones that weren't together. So anyways, very neat. Any other questions that anyone may have?
I have a question. So I've volunteered, and I've noticed that when planting these plants, they would come as little babies. Is there a benefit to doing that versus simply just sticking the seed into the ground? I think I've heard somewhere that you probably want to establish the root system or something like that. Well, can you explain the benefits?
Yeah, I don't know like a ton about it, but I do know we've been thinking about seeding rather than putting nursery plants in. One challenge in the wildland with seeding is that animals will just come and find the free buffet. And so when you have birds and other little animals in the area, it's hard to keep those seeds where you want them and growing. Even with like tiny sprouts and like small plants, generally, predation is a real concern. We did fabricate a little seed shelter that we are going to try out hopefully this year, and just do like extreme invasive removal, like really get every single guy out of there, put the seeds down, and then put on this like net/shade structure that'll hopefully facilitate the growth of those seeds in a certain area, and see how that does. I know Sage, another mountain, he's now a manager, at one point scraped the soil and just threw some seeds down that he collected from the general area. And the next year they were doing super well. There was like a bunch of little babies. But then I think that area in particular flooded this year. So we don't get super long-term effects of that particular trial. But I think it's a really interesting thing to explore. I think you're also right about root establishment, and also I think just establishment in the first place. Seedlings tend to need more water and need more care at the beginning of their life. And so by having them in a nursery, for a long time, they get like a greenhouse to sprout in, and then daily or like very often watered in the nursery. And so they're able to thrive very well in the first year of their life. And that gives them a little more ground to stand on when they go in the really rough conditions out there. And so I think that also is a consideration, especially in Southern California, where our conditions are really, really rough for plants, even our native species. But we have seen, I think you were at the site where we had all those little baby sagebrushes. Like we do see what we call volunteers, plants that have come up from the seeds of the area. And that's very encouraging. It means that we've been keeping invasives down. It means that the ecosystem, as Fernando suggested, is coming back on its own. And so that is a great question though. And I think other places have done it in different ways. And I think it's worth exploring more as we go forward.
Yeah, I was planning to do that myself, and I'm afraid to just seed bomb my garden, and then, you know, birds come by and peck it, and then, oh, there goes my seeds, you know.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think we like fabricated something out of PVC and like net mesh, or like chicken wire kind of stuff. So you could try it. We have plans if you want us to send it to. I think there's like a drawn out plan if you want to make it yourself.
Yeah, that'd be nice. Thank you.
Yeah, send me an email. I'll try to find them.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Any other questions? And thank you all for joining us tonight too. Much appreciated.
I just want to thank you for doing these. They're just so informative, and you all do such a great job of presenting the information. It's very useful. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to Heather and to Stephanie for doing an awesome job.
And did we want to ask for any comments or final thoughts from our participants, or maybe something new that you took away from this evening that you didn't know before?
And you can feel free to put that in the chat too, if you would like.
Yeah, even though I've been in this space for a while, I don't think I'd ever heard the term hydrophobia. really hit me. It's like land being afraid of water. Wow.
It's true. I worked in Sequoia after the fires, and we were trying to map streams, and there were just like streams that popped out of nowhere because the water was just not going into the ground. It was really crazy. So it's real and crazy as it sounds. One more thing I'll add about that Alyssa mentioned earlier that I forgot to talk about is in the waterways, we're thinking about invasive species. We have some wonderful native amphibians, frogs and toads, that really like the loose sediment. And so when that loose sediment changes, when it's all arundo, say, they have nowhere to like shimmy in and hibernate and survive the summer. So even more things to think about.
It was pretty amazing to see last time I was up there, all the tadpoles in the waterway. There's so many of them, like a good sign.
Yeah, they're all frogs now, and they're hopping around, and we've been rescuing them off the road.
Yeah, I saw them.
Yeah.
I was there, was it Sunday? And the water just dried up, but the toads and the frogs were still there.
Yeah,
So
survival.
are they gonna survive that dry area, or are they still figuring out how to survive that area? They're so cute, by the way.
They are super cute. If anyone wants to see teeny tiny frogs, come out to San Francisco Canyon. But I think there will be some if they've like just matured that still need water and might not make it. But I think there are older ones out there that will engage in that burrowing behavior and like tap into the water that's under the ground and keep moist. And then like maybe go even deeper and are able to like shelter for the summer. But I do want to learn more about frogs. That's a new goal. I know Alyssa has been learning a lot about frogs. But they're looking good still. There's a lot that are still alive, and the water's been gone for maybe like a week and a half, 2 weeks now. So they're
That's
doing
not-
okay.
Well, I was wondering if it was like, you know, how there's algae growing there. Are they making use off of that to keep
Yeah.
moist?
I definitely think the algae is like holding some of the water, and we've seen them kind of, we called it the algae hotel, the frog algae hotel, and they're like popping out of different pockets of the algae that was in the water. So I do think the algae is going to help them out as it dries up, but the algae will also dry up eventually. We haven't seen water in that stream for, Alyssa said, the whole time that she's worked here, which is like 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 now. So it was a rare opportunity for them to have so many babies.
Steph, do you know what species it is? Is it a royal toad or what?
I think we have a lot of California tree frogs. I think that's the majority of them. There are also some toads. I think it's the royal toad with the little stripe on the back, but it's a mix. There's like the bigger ones that are the toads. They're like slightly bigger right now, but they'll get bigger. And then the tree frogs are little babies. And then some of them are bright green, which is fun. But then some of them are brown. Again, I want to learn more.
I just want to say thank you on a sentimental note. I started volunteering in San Fran in September of 2020, and it was one of the few places available to do that kind of work or anything, actually for places I could go to in 2020. And it was really, really important, I think, for my mental health that year. And, you know, Matt is fond of saying, if you take care of the land takes care of you. And I really have found that to be true. So I'm so grateful to Tree People and all the teams, because I know there's a lot that goes into it to create these opportunities for us to come and feel so rejuvenated in these spaces.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing. We're very happy to have all of our volunteers. You guys are all so amazing. It makes the days so much better to see you guys, and especially familiar faces who keep coming back. It's really great.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And we will have this recording, I think we'll post on there's a Water Talks website. So you will be able to share it with your friends soon. So thank you so much for joining us, and feel free to reach out with any questions or anything that comes up. We are available.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Awesome job, you guys.
Oh my God.
Really well done. You both did so great.